Times are strange and uncertain, and in these times of uncertainty, the United States is distinctly lacking in leadership on several fronts. In an unprecedented move, the House of Representatives ousted its Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, after all of the Democrats and 8 Republicans voted to do so. The problem is, with a vacancy that's eager to be filled, there's no obvious candidate to fill it. Hello and welcome to the Modern Context Podcast. I'm your host, Yasmin Aliyah Khan, and I'm very happy that you're here. This is our 5th episode, and that feels like a bit of a milestone, a small one, but a milestone nonetheless. If this isn't your first time, thank you so much for coming back, and if it is, thank you for giving this a shot. And while you're here, go ahead and subscribe to the pod so you don't miss any future episodes. In the last episode, in case you missed it, we talked about what was going on between Armenia and Azerbaijan after an old land dispute and old grievances flared back up. These grievances and disputes went back decades or centuries depending on how and what you're counting, and they involved a few different conflating factors, like religious differences, ethnic differences and ancestral homelands, pogroms and genocide, proxy wars, and foreign intervention from parties that were ultimately looking out for their own best interests rather than actually trying to resolve the conflict, and of course, the loss of innocent lives in both nations. Whenever I look at global conflicts like the one we discussed in the last episode, that last bit is always the hardest part to cope with. When you think about how many hundreds or thousands of people die just because some person somewhere or even a handful of people made a misguided or negligent or straight up evil decision, it never seems worth it because it never is. Without painting too broad of a stroke, whatever outcome is ultimately achieved in these types of conflicts, it almost always could have been achieved without innocent people having to have died first. And it's not just people dying or otherwise suffering. It's the destruction of land that takes decades to recover. It's centuries of history that gets lost forever. It's the irreparable psychological damage people and families suffer after having endured the worst manifestation of hatred imaginable. It's the fear that it will happen again. And if history tells us anything, it will happen again. It might look a little different next time, but it will happen again. That stuff doesn't make it into history books, though. So much of human history can be reduced to a section of a chapter in a school textbook. When I was in school, history was always one of my favorite subjects. I even took a history elective my senior year of high school. Who does that? Shout out to Mr. Cooch. But even before high school, I remember this distinctly. I was in 5th grade, and we were learning about the Pilgrims coming over on the Mayflower from Europe. It was that lesson when, for whatever reason, it became so real to me. It was the emotional realization that actual people lived these lives that I was learning about hundreds of years later. I thought about how scared they must have been, leaving everything they knew behind and setting out for an untamed and unfamiliar wilderness, a literal ocean away from everything and everyone they knew. And yeah, what I learned about the Pilgrims back in the 90s was definitely a flawed and one-sided retelling of the story. No offense to Miss Gerald, she was actually a great teacher. I do remember wondering how Squanto already knew English, though. I know why now. This episode isn't about what happened over the weekend between Israel and Palestine. While I don't think that I'm capable of offering any more than people already have on social media, in terms of solace or comfort or explanation, I will say that my heart breaks for the innocent lives that have been and are still being lost, not just over the weekend, but for decades. Each of these lives is a full life that deserves to be protected. Each of these people who are unhoused, captured, tortured, or killed is deserving of protection, peace, and love. Geopolitics aside, it's good to study the history of conflicts and to understand the key players and to keep up with current events because that's how we learn about the world and that's how we learn about each other. But none of that should ever take away from the humanity underlying all of it. One day these lives will be mentioned, not by name, but by number, in a line in a textbook somewhere. The surrounding paragraph might go into the smallest detail about the atrocities they endured in their very last moments, and that will be how history remembers them. But today isn't that day. Today we can practice empathy. Today we grieve. As far as politics here in the US goes, we're in a troubling state. For one, we don't currently have a US ambassador to Israel, and now would be a great time to have one of those. We also don't have a lot of military leaders in position, thanks to particularly obstructive members of our own Congress, one in particular. And speaking of Congress, our lower house, the House of Representatives, is currently without its speaker. By the time you watch or listen to this episode, maybe things will be different, but as of me recording this right now, we have no speaker. And that's not normal. In fact, it's historically abnormal. Kevin McCarthy, the now former Republican Speaker of the House, was the first speaker in our nation's history to be removed from office. Impressive. But what isn't impressive is really anything else about Kevin McCarthy. I don't even say that to be petty. His biography is surprisingly mediocre and unremarkable. If you wanted to, you could argue that he embodies the quote-unquote American dream and that he worked his way all the way up to Speaker of the House to second in line for the presidency by just being Kevin. Again, I'm really not trying to diminish his accomplishments. He did figure some things out on his own. For example, he knew how to align himself with the right people. And he was especially good at building rapport with his colleagues, which served him well as House Majority Whip. He was also known for being an extraordinary fundraiser, something that definitely comes in handy in politics. Still, he wasn't a great student nor a great athlete in school. He didn't attend any fancy Ivy League. He actually won the lottery and invested his winnings and became an entrepreneur right out of high school. He had a speech impediment that he had to work to overcome. He won his congressional seat in a very safe and winnable red district. He wasn't known for his political acumen once he got to Congress. And he became whip and later majority leader by taking over the vacated positions of his mentor. So yeah, he did well for himself. Having worked his way that far up the political ladder, when he was finally up for speaker in 2015, he lost the role to Paul Ryan. Technically, he pulled himself out of consideration, but he did so because he knew he didn't have the support he would need to win. When Ryan retired in 2018, the Dems took back the House and McCarthy was made minority leader. When the Republicans won the House in 2022, McCarthy seemed like the obvious choice for speaker. But even then, he would have to fight to convince his colleagues that he was the right choice. His ultimate ascension to the speakership was an embarrassing and undignified spectacle, to say the least. And then, not even a year after serving in the role, he would be removed by the same people who put him there. I'm sure if you're listening to this that you're at least familiar with recent events, but I'll give you a quick recap of how we got to the place of a speakerless House. So back when Trump was first elected as president, McCarthy played fairly nicely with him, even going so far as to back Trump as he was getting impeached for the first time. But the relationship would sour following the events of January 6th, 2021, when McCarthy would condemn Trump for his role in inciting the insurrection at the Capitol. Not only did Trump turn decidedly against McCarthy for this, but McCarthy would have to spend the next couple of years earning back Trump's favor, even though he was no longer the president or in government at all. It wasn't Trump's direct approval he needed, though. It was the rightist wing of the Republican Party that McCarthy was after. He'd need their support if he wanted to one day be speaker. Unfortunately, they were not terribly impressed with McCarthy, seeing him as not being conservative enough for their liking, and they saw him as weak in his dealings with the Democratic Speaker, Nancy Pelosi. When the Republicans narrowly took back the House following the 2022 midterms, they kept McCarthy on as their leader, but it would take 15 grueling rounds of votes before McCarthy secured the necessary votes to become Speaker of the House. It was the first time in 100 years that the Speaker vote took more than one round. McCarthy's speakership was hard-won. He made several concessions to appease the members of the far-right Freedom Caucus who were blocking his win, concessions that diminished his stature as Speaker from the outset. For one, members of the Freedom Caucus wanted more representation on the powerful House Rules Committee, So McCarthy promised them that. Most notably, though, he agreed to a measure that would allow a single lawmaker to force a vote for his removal, whereas previously, it would have required the majority of their party. It was this concession that would eventually damn his tenure as Speaker. Fast forward to September of the same year, and Congress is facing a looming government shutdown. The same Freedom Caucus members who disrupted the Speaker election until they finally got what they want out of it were vying to shut the government down again unless their demands were met. As the entire nation watched apprehensively, McCarthy managed to negotiate with members of both parties well enough to avoid a shutdown. The American people were happy and relieved, but the Freedom Caucus was not. Representative Matt Gaetz brought forth the motion to vacate McCarthy from the speakership, and with the support of the Democrats and 7 other Republicans, McCarthy was out, but with no obvious successor. But according to Gaetz, he had Trump's blessing in doing what he did. And if you believe the rumors, Gaetz might have his own reasons for doing what he did. In bringing this vote forth, even without having a plan to remedy the situation he created, he managed to get on the news, so he's gotten tons of publicity, and he's been fundraising off of his moment. People are suspecting that Gaetz is hoping to capitalize on the Florida governor's waning popularity and make a bid for the job within the next few years, at which point he'll be able to funnel all of his money from his federal campaign into his state campaign. In McCarthy's own words, for Gaetz, this was all about getting attention and being chaotic. It had nothing to do with governing, especially not at the federal level. If Gaetz gets attention, he gets money, which maybe means that he gets to be the governor of Florida. Oh, and he's squarely in Trump's pocket, admittedly doing Trump's bidding, which I guess he thinks will be of some benefit to him in the future. As of Wednesday, October 11th, Representative Steve Scalise, the current House Majority Leader, was nominated by the Republicans to succeed McCarthy as Speaker, winning the nomination over the Trump-endorsed Representative Jim Jordan, but just barely. Since it was such a narrow nomination, the vote for Speaker was pushed back indefinitely, presumably because Scalise needs to whip up the votes he needs to take the gavel. It's also worth mentioning that time isn't on anyone's side here. McCarthy was able to avoid a government shutdown, but it was really just a 45-day extension to continue negotiations. In other words, if something doesn't come together quickly, the government will end up shutting down sometime next month. Additionally, there's the situation in Israel and Palestine that flared up in the middle of all of this, and then there's also the Biden impeachment inquiry that McCarthy was sort of bullied into opening while he was trying to prevent the shutdown. So all this talk about the Speaker, what does the Speaker even do, and why does it matter that we don't have one? Basically, every 2 years, a new Congress elects a new Speaker. Each party nominates a candidate, and the nominee from the majority party typically wins. The Speaker is the one with the gavel. They administer oaths of office to the new House members, they moderate floor debates, they preside over House votes, they oversee committee appointments, and they have to ensure that the House adheres to the proper standards of operation. Overall, a good Speaker sees to it that the House is being productive and passing legislation. Traditionally, the Speaker is nominated from amongst the sitting members of the House, but that's not explicitly a constitutional requirement. That's why there was talk and debate about whether or not Trump or even the former Speaker, Newt Gingrich, could be nominated as the Speaker to replace McCarthy. So the Speaker has quite a few responsibilities on their shoulder, on top of fulfilling their existing duties to their constituents in the district that they represent. But one of the more interesting things about the role is that the Speaker is second in line for the presidency right after the Vice President. If something were to happen to both the President and the Vice President at the same time, then the Speaker would step into the Oval Office. And it would kind of have to be a case where something would happen to both the President and the Vice President before the Speaker could ascend to the presidency. So let's say something happens to the President and the Vice President becomes the new President. The new President would now get to appoint whoever they want to be the new VP, and then the Senate would confirm the new VP. Unless they were nominated for the vice presidency by the new president, the speaker would just remain the speaker. The speaker wouldn't automatically get bumped up to VP. In our nation's history, only one speaker has ever gone on to become president, and this wasn't how it happened. It was James K. Polk, and he got there after somehow securing the Democratic nomination for president following a particularly unsettled Democratic convention. He wasn't popular, but after 9 rounds of voting, he was finally chosen as the party's nominee. That said, this all took place in the 1840s. Back then, we didn't even have the rules for succession in place like we do today. Let's take it back to 1792 and have a look at the first iteration of the Presidential Succession Act. The original Presidential Succession Act stated that the Senate's president pro tempore would be second in line for the presidency, followed by the Speaker of the House. After Speaker, it would go to the Secretary of State. It was suspected that it was done this way because the Federalists, specifically Alexander Hamilton, at the time weren't fond of the then Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, so they didn't want him that close to the presidency. Joke was on them. Still, it didn't make a whole lot of sense to have the president pro tempore that high in the ranking. The position doesn't actually hold too much power. Its main role is to preside over the Senate in the absence of the vice president. But the majority leader is really the one who takes care of most of the governing aspects of the Senate. Anyway, they kept that arrangement for a few years until 1881, when Charles Guiteau shoots President Garfield at a train station proclaiming, "Arthur is president now." Chester Arthur was Garfield's vice president, and if Guiteau had actually managed to kill Garfield, he would have been right. Unfortunately, the 2 bullets didn't kill Garfield. Instead, one of the bullets remained lodged somewhere inside of Garfield, and Garfield himself remained deeply incapacitated for a whopping 80 days before finally succumbing to his infected injuries. In his final days, he was beset with angina, sepsis, and pneumonia, and ultimately, a ruptured splenic artery aneurysm would kill him. So he wasn't dead, but for 80 days, he wasn't in any condition to be running the country. His vice president was left somewhat in limbo, as no one was sure whether or not he should remain as acting president or if he should just assume the position officially. On top of Garfield's problems, though, Arthur was himself pretty sick. He was eventually diagnosed with Bright's disease, an inflammatory kidney disease that at the time was fatal. Today, nephritis is somewhat manageable, but back then it was killing him slowly. To make matters worse, this all took place during a time when Congress was not in session, so there was no president pro tem to step in. For a few months, with the president on his deathbed and the vice president suffering in silence, things were a little dicey. But when Garfield finally died, Arthur was sworn in. Once he became president, though, there was no vice president, nor was there a president pro tem or a speaker. So this very sick president now had no line of succession. Thankfully, he made it through to the end of his term, but when President Grover Cleveland's VP died while in office a few years later, it was the same thing all over again. It was clear that the Presidential Succession Act needed to be revised, so they did just that in 1886. This time, the Secretary of State was put in line behind the VP, followed by other presidential cabinet members. The president pro tem and the speaker were removed from the line of succession. Fast forward now to the 1940s. FDR dies and Truman takes over. President Truman drops 2 nukes on Japan, ending the war and changing the world forever. Truman wanted to alter the line of succession because he believed that just as the president was democratically elected by the people, so should his successors be. He didn't think it was fair that the president would essentially be able to appoint his own successor. He sought to move the successors from the executive branch back to the legislative branch. This time, however, he placed the speaker directly behind the vice president and directly ahead of the president pro tem. One of his reasons for doing this was that, as I mentioned earlier, the president pro tem doesn't actually do a lot of governing, but the speaker does. Also, since the House is reflective of population, its representatives were seen to be more of the people than the senators. Even though representatives are only elected by the people in their districts, they're arguably more directly connected to their constituents than senators are, and the Speaker of the House is approved of, nominated by, and elected by other representatives. After the president pro tem, the succession kicks over to the cabinet, and that's more or less the system that we've got in place today. In 1967, the 25th Amendment clarified that once a vice president assumes the Oval Office, they become the president, distinct from an acting president. And all of this came to test just a few years later amidst the Watergate scandal of the Nixon administration, kind of. Nixon's VP, Spiro Agnew, resigned from the role because he was being accused of tax evasion. But instead of the Speaker of the House stepping up to fill the VP vacancy, Nixon instead nominated the House Minority Leader, Gerald Ford, to replace Agnew. Following a Senate confirmation, Ford was sworn in as the new VP, and when Nixon resigned from the presidency, Gerald Ford became president. And that's how we ended up with the Speaker of the House so close and yet so far away from the presidency. It's not a perfect system, though. There have been arguments that since the Speaker is integral to the impeachment process, that presents a conflict of interest. For instance, before his ousting, McCarthy opened an impeachment inquiry against Biden. In the unlikely event that Biden were to get impeached and removed from office, and if he were to take his VP down with him before she had time to be sworn in as president and before a new VP nominee could be confirmed by the Senate, McCarthy would have been able to take the presidency for himself. Again, that all seems highly unlikely, but I suppose stranger things have happened. That all presents another conflict. The American people would have elected a Democratic president, but in this hypothetical scenario, a Republican would end up replacing him since the current House is being held by Republicans. Realistically, none of this would play out this way, and in most cases, the president and the vice president won't go down without first nominating a successor. It is possible, of course, that the Senate won't confirm the nominee, which is something that they seem particularly fond of not doing these days. So there are always opportunities for obstruction within government. As of recording this, Scalise is the current Republican nominee for Speaker, but he's fighting an uphill battle. Jim Jordan still has a lot of hardline supporters who seem determined to make this Speaker vote as difficult as the last one. At the very least, they've learned that the longer they hold out, the more leverage they have with the future Speaker, the more concessions they can get out of him, and the more powerful they can become. Marjorie Taylor Greene was literally holding the Speaker's gavel at one point. That's how beholden McCarthy had become to her, or that's how it came across. Between the two top candidates for Speaker, neither are great. Scalise has a history of associating with white supremacists, and he's expressed interest in the past for defunding programs like Social Security and Medicare. Jim Jordan played a major role in the Capitol insurrection and coup attempt on January 6th, and he's been accused of covering up nearly 200 incidents of sexual abuse during his time as an assistant wrestling coach at Ohio State University. So not exactly the best of the best. Trump was floated as a potential speaker for a bit, but that didn't go very far, especially since Trump actually endorsed Jordan for the position. And then there was mention of Newt Gingrich stepping back into the mix after having stepped down from the speakership in 1999. Gingrich is often credited with radicalizing the speakership, pioneering many of the highly partisan tactics we still are dealing with today. He was the worst, but he's been fairly quiet in recent years. That might have something to do with the fact that he is now 80 years old. Who gets back into government at 80 years old? Now the House needs to vote on a new speaker, and I expect it will eventually be Scalise, but I don't know how long he'll stay in the position, especially with the 2024 election expected by some to flip the House. It's also not uncommon for speakers to step down from their position before their term is up. It's a tough job and no one seems willing to do it. It requires that someone be the adult in a room full of entitled children. It sets career politicians up for failure in a way that many would understandably prefer not be the cap on the tip of their legacies. What kind of person would even want that job? Uncertainty is something that will always be certain, just like death and taxes. But you have to admit that these are strange historic times. We have unnecessary vacancies in high-ranking government positions, vacancies that are seemingly being perpetrated out of spite in both the military and the diplomatic sectors. We have 3 geriatric branches of government, and we have members of government who are willing to break rules and break precedents to meet whatever end they're after, even if they have little to no justification for the acts they commit or the steps that they take. President Biden is facing an impeachment inquiry, and even with all of the Republicans digging for dirt on him, they've still come up empty-handed. They're proceeding with the inquiry anyway. And who knows, they might still end up impeaching Biden, still without any credible evidence of wrongdoing. It certainly wouldn't be surprising at this point. There's also probably a good chance that the government will end up shutting down in November. McCarthy managed to avoid a shutdown at the last minute, and he was removed from his position for doing so. I expect that if Scalise wants to win his votes, he'll have to agree not to compromise with the Democrats the way McCarthy did, even though that's kind of the Speaker's job. And Matt Gaetz, the representative who brought forth the motion to vacate in the first place, apparently with Trump's blessing, seems to have only done so as a chaos agent. He never had a strong or convincing reason for seeking McCarthy's removal, and he certainly made his rounds on the news stations talking about it. He unapologetically fundraised off of it, sending out emails and text messages to his supporters asking them for donations to his cause. There's also speculation that Gaetz has his eye on the Florida governorship, especially now that Governor DeSantis is seeing a rapid decline in popularity with his failing presidential bid. The most jarring aspect of all of this was that even as Gaetz and other members of Congress were calling for McCarthy's removal, none of them had a plan for what would happen if and when they were successful. They didn't have much of an idea, let alone a consensus, of who they wanted to see as Speaker instead. They just knew that they wanted McCarthy gone, and frankly, as elected officials who were chosen by the American people to lead on our behalf, there's no excuse for that level of short-sightedness. But I'm sure they'll chug along as always. With the situation in Israel intensifying, perhaps they'll have a bit more incentive to function as an actual governing body in one way or another, but the coming weeks will tell. All right, guys, that about wraps up this episode. Be sure to come back and join us on the next episode of ModCon Pod. I would love to see you again. In the meantime, we would love to hear from you. Reach out to the show at hello@modconpod.com with any suggestions or questions you might have for us. Also, don't forget to follow and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. Find us on YouTube, tell your friends about us, and of course, thank you all for listening and for making it this far. I can't wait to see you next time. Cheers. Modern Context is a Rabble Babble production, produced by Brandon Morgan and recorded live in Houston, Texas. For Modern Context, I'm your writer and host, Yasmin Aliyah Khan.